Hello, BookTube. I have a video for you today of recommendations for Nonfiction November. Now, that is an event that's being hosted by Olive at a Book Olive and Gemma at Nonfic Books, in which in the month of November they encourage you all to read nonfiction and to explore its wonders, to read more nonfiction if you read some already, and to read it, to try it if you never do read it, if you give it a wide berth for a whole bunch of predictable but unfair reasons that you've been conditioned to think that it's boring or intimidating or, requires extra work or can't ever be enjoyed in the visceral way that we think of with fiction, where you lose yourself in the work. And of course, I agree with the aim behind Nonfiction November completely. If it weren't for the loss of alliteration, I would say that Nonfiction November should be every month. I love it more than anything. And I want to take the opportunity throughout the month of November to make recommendations to you. 9 recommendations per video. 9 Nonfiction November gems for you to think about. And I've got them on the trusty iPad here. One thing that I've noticed with a little trial video that I did is that this new filming arrangement with the MacBook creates a bit of a problem with glare and flashback with when I'm showing you a lighted source. I have a feeling, I'm too eager to wait and find out, but I have a feeling that a lot of these problems are going to be solved once the room is suffused with daylight. I seem to remember that the MacBook does a wonderful job once it has that basic tool. It's lacked it all day today. It's been as dark as twilight all day today in Boston, and now it's nighttime. So when the sun next appears, we'll give that a try and see if we can't up the visual quality of these videos just a bit. But in the meantime, I want to make 9 recommendations for you of works of nonfiction across a fairly wide spectrum, just for you to think about. And the first one is this. It's Golden Guidebook to Birds. It's old. It's probably 50 years old, maybe more than that. It's the best-selling example of the Golden Guidebooks, these little paperbacks. This is a study of North American birds with a full-color illustration and a little bit of description on each page. You just turn through it. It's as big as your hand. And it's utterly delightful. It's completely charming. It definitely is my first recommendation. My second recommendation is going to be a little harder to find, probably. It's by Joseph Dean, and it's Hatred, Ridicule, and Contempt. A book of libel cases, famous libel cases in British legal history, which might sound dry, but the writer has a great way with bringing court transcripts to life. And some of these trials are so wonderful, so wonderfully mean, and all-encompassingly withering that if you like legal writing, if, for instance, you like legal fiction, legal thrillers, courtroom dramas, why not read the real thing? that's the basic urging behind any kind of nonfiction November event or nonfiction recommendations from nonfiction fans. The underlying urging sentiment is always, why read the knockoff when you can read the original? So that might crop up again in this video. The next one is military history. You all know that I like me some military history, and it's a slim thing, 150 pages at most, but it is brilliant. It's Bruce Bliven. It's the Battle for Manhattan, in which British forces chase American revolutionary forces led by George Washington down the whole length of the island of Manhattan. With the Americans giving ground the whole time, trying to avoid simple annihilation in the field the whole time. And Bliven does a great job with it. Just no tinny heroics pumped into the narrative. Just a straightforward military historical account of what happens. But what happened in that brief time was so thrilling that when you get out of the story's way, it actually turns into a wonderful narrative. So I think the Battle for Manhattan is out of print. I think a lot of these books are out of print, but you might be able to find it, and if it interests you, you should, because it's worth the look. Next one. Next one's a little grim. Perfectly willing to admit that. There are a couple of grim items on this list of recommendations. Grim can still be good. I know I'm not doing I'm not doing Nonfiction November any favors by recommending long, grim, depressing works. A lot of people who don't read nonfiction already consider it along those lines. But I'm going to recommend it anyway because it's brilliant. It's The Worst of Evils by Thomas Dormandy, and it is a history of pain. I'm just realizing belatedly I could perhaps have made this first batch of 9 recommendations a little more inviting. But still, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant study, not only of the history of humankind's understanding of pain, the physiological basis of pain, but also the social and psychological place that pain has had in human societies all across the West for 1,000 years. It's amazing. It's tough reading, but it's also a unifying reading. There's none of us that hasn't experienced pain, so it's a book on a subject that was a perfect example of the kind of book where I didn't know that I wanted to read a big, serious, scholarly work on the subject until one showed up, and then all of a sudden I did. Next one is hysterical, and I mean that in both senses of the word. It is both out of its mind and very funny, unintentionally. This is Prince Jack by Frank Spiering, and it is subtitled "The True Story of Jack the Ripper." And there's a review blurb on the front cover. The John Barkham Reviews was a review firm that really should have gone out of business when they gave this blurb. The quote is, "The case for Queen Victoria's grandson as Jack the Ripper has never been so cogently argued or solidly documented. If you find a copy of this wonderful old book and read it, and you can spot any solid documentation anywhere in its length, you go ahead and email me." There isn't any, of course. Prince Albert Victor was not Jack the Ripper. There is ample documentation from dozens and dozens of different corroborating sources for his whereabouts on every one of the days in question. But it's not so much that the book is completely on its face wrong from the very beginning to the very end. It's how it's written. The author maintains a historical tone of narrative for about 30 or 40 pages and then just loses it completely and starts raving. And it's hilarious to read. You wouldn't think it. A book on Jack the Ripper, you might not think that it would be funny, and there are plenty of serious books on Jack the Ripper that I'd be happy to recommend, but this one is not to be missed. The next one has a grim title, but it's not all grim. It's a book I've recommended on this channel before. Cannot recommend it strongly enough. It's 1,000 pages long. It's a big brick of a thing, but it's well worth your time. And it's also not an intimidating 1,000 pages because it's meant to be sampled and tasted here and there on a nightstand. That's how I've done it. I've made my way all the way through it from start to finish, probably 3 times, and never reading it in long, page-by-page, consecutive chunks. It's the Assassin's Cloak. Big, gigantic compendium of diary entries throughout the ages. So it's dates. It's day by day. So you get February 13th, and you'll have an entry of a diary in February 13th from 1603, and then from somebody else in 1750, and then from somebody else in 1780, and then from somebody else in 1941. And some of the names keep cropping up. Some of them come and then fade away. And it's amazing. It's just amazing. It will make you want to keep a diary of your own or revive one if you used to keep one. But in addition to that, it will make plenty of the names that trape through these pages are famous people and will make you know them the way you never thought of them before. It's I have a weakness. Of course, I've been keeping a journal forever and ever and ever. So I have a weakness for collections of diaries and journals, but this is by far the best one. And then another grim book. So it's small, unlike the Pain book. It's very short, but it's on an unremittingly bleak subject. It's just beautifully done. It's Mortality by Christopher Hitchens, who was a prolific writer, a prolific columnist, and who was, at age 60, handed the perfect subject. Unfortunately, he was handed the perfect subject. Someone diagnosed him with cancer. And he had a long dark night of the soul, and then made the almost immediate decision of, well, there's no other response that I can have to this than to write about it. It's all I do. So he wrote about it to the end. And the early columns, the ones that appeared in Vanity Fair magazine, are incredibly brave. They're just incredibly brave. I had my issues with Hitchens, and I had tussles with him in and out of print. But this was an incredibly brave book to write, a naked, vulnerable book to write. I have a good deal of knowledge of what he was going through, and the last thing in the world you feel like doing, if you're of a certain generation, is sharing it, much less sharing it with the whole world, and to do it anyway, and so effectively, and even sometimes so amusingly. It's a masterful performance. It's a wonderful book that I really wish had never been written. I wish that Hitchens were still here and still writing. But what a monument to leave behind. And it's as grim as it is, it's also a perfect example of what you'll get from nonfiction that you won't get from fiction. I guarantee you, if somebody wrote a fictional version of this, a famous contrarian writer dying of cancer and writing about it, it would come off as saccharine. I've read a lot of novels that had a device like that in it, and none of them convinced. And this is convincing from the first page. It's all true. So then the next one is a huge work of history. don't click off yet. I'm just getting used to this. So it's a great old historian. He's not read anymore. He's not consulted anymore, and he should be, because he is as great a prose stylist as Edward Gibbon is famous for being. This is William Prescott. This is History of the Conquest of Mexico and his History of the Conquest of Peru. This cover is to the big fat Everyman's Library edition that combined his two best-selling books. But you can get the History of the Conquest of Mexico on its own in multiple used editions. Pretty sure Prescott isn't in print anymore, and that's a shame, because he's a really good writer, and he worked hard on these books, really hard. And the first one, The History of the Conquest of Mexico, was on my mind because in 2018, a new book is coming out on the subject of the conquest of Mexico, on the subject of Cortez and Montezuma and the conquest of the city that would give rise to Mexico City. And it's a fantastic subject. And I saw a listing for this new history, and I will definitely give it a try, because the historian who writes it is a very serious guy. He's a really good researcher and a very good, solid, sober prose stylist. So if he writes a book on a subject that's taken him years to research, you have to read it. But I freely admit I have loyalties in this case. I have spent endless hours of pure delight with Prescott. So I realize that cannot stop new research from happening, but still, that's what had me in mind to recommend this thing. I highly recommend that you go and find this edition, which has both it's a big, satisfying, plump thing in the hand, and he's wonderful to read. You should read everything by him. And then we'll do the last one. This is recommendation number 9. I hope I'm counting these right. I'm getting many little snide remarks about my innumeracy. I can't help it. When I recommend books, I lose track of time. But then the last one we're going to do is new. Unlike all these other things, you could probably still go to a bookstore and find it, and it'll be on every website in the world. You won't have to chase down a used copy. I think I've recommended it on this channel before. It's superb. It's Tom Nichols' The Death of Expertise, about the subtitle is The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. And of course, the subtext lurking behind that subtitle is the internet. We live in a post-fact world. I'm sure you've all heard that horrible term, and yet, how close to true is it that somebody can say, well, my truth says this, and your truth, you're an expert, you've studied this subject X for years, your truth may say Y, but my truth says X, and we are equal. And that's a real danger. And not only is it absurd, it's a real danger. And Nichols he's a fantastic writer. He does a great job of unpacking what it means for 21st century America. I mean, we all know that we're talking about America here. He does a great job of unpacking what it means when otherwise normal, sensible, law-abiding, family-raising adults decide that expertise doesn't matter. And that, it's a gripping thing to read. You'll love it. You'll in fact love all of these, all 9 of these recommendations. I'm fairly confident of that. These are surefire winners. And there's plenty more to come. I'm going to do 9 nonfiction November recommendations quite a bit in the upcoming month because there's so much to recommend. But for right now, I'm gonna sign off, and I'll see you soon. Thank you, Book 2.